And then we'll say, look, you've learned about escalation of commitment.
You say books. What do you mean by books? Like real books?
Yeah, like real books. The first set we're doing right now is behavioral economics, behavioral science books. I'll give you an example. There's this great book by Leidy Klotz. It's called Subtract. It just came out. It's awesome.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that. I haven't read it.
It's really nice. And it's one of the books in our app. And what we do is he has an experiment where there's a grid. Okay, so people come in the app, they see a grid, and the grid has different colors. And so your job is when you click on a tile, it changes the color. It flips it. It's a little game. And what you want to do is you want to try to make the grid symmetric color-wise, okay? And you go, you play with it, and you find that in about 12 flips, you can make it symmetric. And there's actually a much easier way to do it than 12. I think it's 4 or 8 steps, much fewer. But when you do the 12, it's because you're looking to add colors to create symmetry. The way you do 4 is you remove colors to create symmetry. And Leidy's point in the book is that in many situations, we look to create good changes by addition. We rarely look to get to where we want through subtraction. Reading Leidy's book is a delight, but playing games like this, where you're kind of struggled with the game, you're like, well, I can't get it, I can't get to the best, and then you have the aha moment, you've learned the subtract lesson by doing it, and you remember that far more. And so with the app, Peak takes these books and creates these experiences. Have I ever told you the story of the Stephen Hawking book, A Brief History of Time?
No.
So this is a book where you see it on everybody's shelf, but nobody's actually read this book, right? I'm sure Stephen Hawking has read this book. I'm hoping his editor has.
Kind of like Thinking Fast and Slow.
Yeah.
I didn't say that. Danny's our friend. I would never say that about that.
Right. Exactly. Oh, yeah. So
Brief History
of Time. I'm convinced nobody has read Brief History of Time. And I was like, maybe I'm being cynical. And then I realized, no, the publishers know this, and they're even more cynical than I am. So I think it was 20th year anniversary of the book. They published a new book, An Even Briefer History of Time. Because they realized, surely people have bought that 200-page one and feel a little guilty not having read it. Let them buy a 100-page version and feel guilty a second time around. It sold pretty well, I think.
Yeah, I bet. But I wonder if it doesn't work, if the point is to impress people.
Yeah, exactly.
The thickness might actually be really important to them.
Exactly. It's one thing to say, have you read A Brief History of Time? It's another thing to say, have you read An Even Briefer History of Time? Yeah, so what the app does is it's our ambitious attempt to change the way people absorb and learn information. And so the activities are just fun and interesting, and they're illustrations of stuff so that you can go through them, and then you walk away having learned it.
Is your thought that people will read the books first and get the lessons reinforced through the app, or that the app potentially becomes a very time-efficient way to avoid having to read 300-page books that only make a couple points?
Yeah, I imagine that for a lot of people, they will do the app, and then for some, it'll motivate them to read more detail in the book. Because it's also more interesting to read a book when you've got a lesson from it motivating you and pushing you through. And I do think there's a time efficiency gain of doing the experience. It's like teaching. You did the $20 bill exercise. It's just so much more efficient than sitting there hearing about escalation of commitment or whatever it might be.
So take a book that many people would know.
We have one that I like, which we can try on your listeners, and I can try on you as well, Steve. It's a memory experiment, okay? I'm going to list a bunch of words. I don't want you writing anything down. And then I want you to, after I list the words, write down whatever you remember. I'm going to list about 10 words. So it's pure memory. I'll say them out loud. Don't do anything. And then after I say go, write down as many as you can remember. Okay, here we go. Bed, rest, awake, nap, dream, wake, doze, snore, slumber, blanket, snooze, tired. Okay, go ahead. Just write down as many of these words as you can remember.
Did you write them down so you know what you actually said?
I did, yes. Okay, do you have it?
All right, so I got 7 written down.
7. Okay, so let's see. Do you have the word bed?
Yes.
Tired?
Nope. Oh, yeah, I do. Yep.
Dream?
Nope.
Slumber?
Yep.
Sleep?
Nope.
Oh. So for your listeners, let's just say you did, Steve. Let's just pretend you had sleep.
Okay.
Okay. So This experiment, over 50% of people remember the word dream, and over 50% of people remember the word sleep. But there's a big difference between those two words. Dream was on my list, sleep was never on my list. You can reliably induce a false memory of the word sleep. And it happens very consistently. This is one of the things that we have in the app. And I'm sure in the audience, some people listening to this podcast will remember having heard the word sleep, and they can go back and listen. I never said the word. And you can see what's happening here. Sleep is in the sort of network of these words. It's like that party where your friend says to you, hey, you remember that party you were at? And you're like, I wasn't at that party. They're like, no, you were there. And it's because every one of your other friends was there. They're like, well, you were there too. And sleep is like that. And so this is a false memory inducement. And you can give all sorts of lectures about people's memory is fallible, don't trust your memory. But you do an experiment like that, and suddenly people are like, I really remember the word sleep. And in fact, you did not remember the word sleep. And it teaches you a lesson around the fallibility of memory.
You live and breathe ideas like few people I've ever known, and academics was made for you and vice versa. But the app won't be the first time you've stepped foot outside of academia. You spent some time as the research lead for the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau during the Obama administration. I mean, the federal government is notorious for red tape. Wasn't that a nightmare for you?
Honestly, at first it was, because the professional world is so complicated. You know what I mean? The toughest part is that the ratio of innovation to execution is so different than what we're used to.
Mm-hmm. It's true.
And so I've gained a lot of respect for people who get shit done, because it is insanely hard. And we somehow put a lot of weight on ideas, but execution is a whole other thing. So in that sense, you're exactly right. There was a nightmare element to it. The part of it that was really interesting, though, was, how would you actually meaningfully protect consumers against a lot of these shitty products while also preserving innovation? These problems are complicated when you start really getting down into them.
So I'm just imagining you with an idea an hour. Each idea requires 3 years of execution. What happened next?
That was not my finest moments. I learned the hard way there that if I want to get things done, I have to figure out how to become a manager, which I was not, or figure out how to get a structure in which I can play a role. It's one thing to not be good at something and to fail at something, but it's another thing to not even know why you're not good at something. Like, the thing about school is someone gives you an exam, you do badly, they tell you what you got wrong, and they tell you the book you need to read to get better. Unfortunately, life does not have any of that. You don't even get a score, you just kind of know you're doing badly. If there's one thing that would be interesting to figure out is, how do you improve learning through the rest of life? School is such an artificial way to think about learning. It's just too much very directed feedback. And then you're thrown out into the world where you get zero directed feedback. And somehow we're not preparing people. I know I was doing badly, but I didn't know what I was supposed to do to fix it.
I think you're right. I'll give you an example where I stumbled in the same way you did. So after frekonomics came out, all sorts of companies would call me up and say, could I do consulting? And I'd say, sure. And they'd say, how much you charge? I'd say, well, I'll do it for free. If you give me the data, I can write my academic papers. And so I would go to these companies, and I had been very successful in academics. So I had a set of rules of thumb about what made for a good question, how you analyzed it. And it turned out that all those rules of thumb, which made a ton of sense in academics, which would take a very small problem, because the reward in academics comes from answering a relatively boring question 100% right. Over the time span of 2 or 3 years, you take your time, you finish. But businesses needed me to answer interesting questions quickly with 80% likelihood that I'm right. And I was not at all suited. And I gave the worst advice. And I always had made fun of other people, because what I've seen too often is people just use whatever rules of thumb have worked on the last problem, and they apply that to the new one without thinking. Hey, that's exactly me. That's exactly what I'm doing. I think it also takes, to learn, you have to really be willing to admit your own flaws. And I think so much in society pushes us against that. So you think that school should be more like life, or the point of school should be to teach people to be learners?
That's the idea I'm throwing around my head these days. You said it perfectly, Steve. could school teach us to be learners, but learners in environments, and in psychology, there's this notion of a wicked environment. A wicked learning environment is one where there's very little feedback. And how would you arm people to be learners in a wicked environment? I don't have an answer to it, but that's the kind of question that I'm throwing around in my head, because that seems like it would have very high return. If we could even make a little bit of progress on that, given that everyone is about to be thrown out into this world. But the second thing we can do is we can ask the question, why are learning environments so wicked? Why is feedback so bad? Jens Ludwig, one of our friends, he's always pointing out to me that if you look at how much feedback judges get, it's basically zero. So you're a judge and you do pretrial, which means you're just trying to decide whether the person should stay at home and wait for trial or whether they should wait for trial in jail. It's a simple decision. In Cook County, you might make it 100 times a day. Now we have the data. We know what happens to those people you send home and how many of them didn't come back. And how much feedback do judges get? Nothing. Like nothing. They don't get a report that says, here's how your cases did after the people were sent home. And if you look at how many situations the decision maker doesn't get much feedback, it's a ton. Like we teach, right? So what feedback do we get? Some stupid teaching evaluations, which are nothing more than at the end of the quarter, what did the person think? There's no, hey, we went and surveyed your students 5 years later, and here are the concepts they remember from your class. I would love to know what that is. Maybe they don't remember any of the concepts from my class. That would be worth knowing. Or which one stuck. Like, you just don't get that much feedback on any of the things that you do all the time. And it just makes for such a terrible learning environment.
I agree 100%. And I also think, though, in many settings, the actors do their best to avoid feedback, because in complex settings like a business environment, I think it's better for most of the people in the firm that nobody has any idea whether their decisions paid off or not. When I've gone to try to run experiments in firms, and I know you've run experiments in firms, it's hard to get them to run. And I used to think the obstacle is that they're expensive and they take a lot of human capacity, a lot of resources. And I've realized over time that nobody actually wants to know whether the decision they made was a good one or a bad one. I don't know if it's because the payoff to good decisions is smaller than the cost of bad decisions. Maybe it's risk aversion, but the bigger obstacle isn't even that. The bigger obstacle is, in order to run an experiment, you have to admit up front that you don't know the answer. And in business, I'm supposed to know whether this advertising works or not. But actually, even though we spend $100 million a year on advertising, I have no idea if it works. To admit that and to say I'm going to learn from an experiment, that's the thing which is really interesting to me, that so differentiates academics from business. As academics, we always start from the principle that we don't know anything. But I think any setting in which people have to pretend like they have expertise, that gets in the way of experimentation and feedback more than anything.
And this is deeply related to the point you said earlier as well, which is like at an individual level, it's just very hard to admit that you're bad at something, that you're wrong. Not wanting to admit up front and not wanting to learn afterwards. Even in academia, when we're exploring new ideas, we say we don't know. But if a PhD student comes to me and says, hey, do these slides make a good talk? A part of me always wants to say, I don't know. It's as hard for me as it is for you. I don't know. Like, I'm just groping around here. But you can't, right? Imagine how disheartening it would be for the student to be like, hey, look, we're all throwing darts. If you want me to throw the darts for you, I can do it too. They don't want to hear that. And that's what's happening in organizations too. At least we imagine leadership involves putting this mantle of, I know exactly what I'm doing. To a degree, it's true. No one wants to follow the general who's like, we're going to go this way. I don't know if it's the right way, guys, but it's a good guess. Let's go. Society would be so different if we could just own up to the sheer level of ignorance that we as experts have about a huge number of things.
So you were in Cambridge, back and forth between Harvard and MIT for over 2 decades. Why did you decide to move to the University of Chicago after all these years?
The honest answer is actually very related to your flipping a coin study, actually. One of the things that was most influential was when I was trying to decide what to do, somebody said to me, sometimes change is good just for change's sake. That really stuck with me because on my pro-con list, nowhere was there written change.
Mm-hmm.
It's like they're material aspects, but when you reflect on it, what's the biggest aspect of this decision? Change. I'm going to be in a whole new city, whole new environment. And so once someone gave me that advice, I was like, oh, this seems like a relatively straightforward thing. Change by itself is just good. It's related to where we started. We ridiculously underweight the value of change. You know what I mean? Like, you think you're the same person wherever you go. That is absolutely not true. You're exposed to new things. Your mind changes. In many ways, I think people become stagnant as they get older because they're not doing enough to expose themselves to truly new situations.
Do you have advice for young people who are trying to figure out their place in the world?
I think the one piece of advice I would give comes from this awesome paper. I think it's Dan Gilbert. It's called The End of History Illusion. If you ask people, how much have they changed in the last 5 years? Most people say a lot, especially young people. Like, take a 22-year-old. Oh my God. Who was I when I was 17? My God, 17 to 22, I changed so much. Then you ask people, how much will you change in the next 5 years? They're like, a little bit. Pick any age. You always act as if history has ended. All the change you're going to do is done, which is absurd because from 17 to 22, you change a lot. 22 to 27, you change a lot. So I think the biggest error people make is they think they are choosing for who they are right now. What they're actually choosing is for this person 5 years from now who's going to be very different from them. Very different from them. So if you say, I'm deciding whether to go work at company A or company B, if you think you're set, what you're choosing is between two companies. If you think that you're changing, what do you change towards? You change towards the people around you. So what you should ask yourself is, I am going to become like the people at company A or like the people at company B. That's who I'm actually going to become. Which of these kinds of people do I want to be as a person? And so that puts a whole different perspective on it, because now you no longer think of yourself. You're actually choosing versions of you. And you really have to accept that. Whenever I try to tell students this, it's amazing how much they resist it. People say this to me, I'm going into consulting, but I'm not going to be the stereotypical consultant. I'm like, my best guess is you are going to be the stereotypical. What do you want me to tell you?
Yeah, I've never heard anyone say what you just said. It's so interesting to hear it.
I want to hear your advice.
It's actually evolved a lot. It's been affected by this podcast and hearing what other people say. But I have come to believe that the single most important thing to recognize when you're young is that life is long and it's not a race. And there's this sense of urgency of not getting off the track of having to do something tomorrow. So before I went back to get a PhD, I spent 2 years doing consulting, and I was panicked that I was behind the other people. Look, it made no sense to be panicked about it. So that's really, to me, not being in a hurry and the luxury of knowing that you can make mistakes, you can experiment, you can dabble, and still have all the time in the world to be what you want to be.
The most interesting people we know didn't know at 22 what they wanted to do. And some of the most interesting people don't know at 40 what they want to do. And that's good. If you're embracing life, that's what's going to happen. Yet somehow you feel like you ought to know. There's this fixation on it. It's okay. There's a lot of other stuff coming down the road.
And I think society's gotten much worse on that. As I look at my teenage kids, the amount of focus they have about what college will they go to, what activities am I doing when I'm 13 that will positively influence my chance of getting into college. And that is a kind of rat race that I think we've done such a disservice to our kids.
I feel like kids get less and less play. I mean, I went to Cornell, it was a very good school. And I remember being stressed about it, but I also didn't think to myself, I needed to check off a bunch of boxes to try and get into the best school. Like, I just felt like I just had to be myself. Like, a ton of time to just explore and just play and acquire interesting ideas and things. It made you able to enjoy and really become intellectual in a way that I couldn't imagine doing if my only goal were to get good grades and check the right boxes. It goes back to your Oculus point. I really liked it when you said these guys were playing with it. Like, play is ridiculously underrated. Every time I've licensed myself to mess around, great things have come. Because that's how you get into really good ideas, is you mess around.
What a great place to stop talking about play, because I really do believe that Sendel's willingness to play is a huge part of what makes him special. And I have to admit, I used to love play. But wow, do I find it hard to play these days with all my other obligations. But I'm making a promise to myself, at least for 1 week, inspired by Sendel, I'm going to make play a priority. So this would have been a natural place to stop our conversation, but with Sendel, we always end up talking for hours and canceling whatever other meetings we had planned. And that's exactly what happened here. We just kept talking. So next week's episode will be the second half of our conversation, where we discuss the implications that artificial intelligence will have on society, his secrets for generating so many ideas, and the radical ideas in his book entitled Scarcity. I saw the title, and it's called Scarcity. And I thought to myself, this is so arrogant, because economics is the study of scarcity. So who does Sendel think he is, that he's going to have something new to say?
People I Mostly Admire is part of the Frekonomics Radio Network, which also includes Frekonomics Radio, No Stupid Questions, and This Won't Hurt a Bit. This show is produced by Frekonomics Radio and Stitcher. Morgan Levy is our producer, and Jasmine Klinger is our engineer. Our staff also includes Allison Craiglow, Greg Rippin, Joel Meyer, Trisha Bobita, Emma Terrell, Lyric Bowditch, and Jacob Clementi. All of the music you heard on this show was composed by Luis Guerra. To listen ad-free, subscribe to Stitcher Premium. We can be reached at pima@frekonomics.com. That's PIMA@frekonomics.com. Thanks for listening.
If somebody provides me detail about anything, and I have no recollection, I believe it's true.
Steve, do you remember that $10,000 bet that we had? I was trying to figure out when you were going to pay me because given that I won that bet.
No, it's not good because there's not enough detail.
The Frekonomics Radio Network.
Stitcher.